and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab and Co-Creation Studio lecture series. I'm Sarah Wallison. I'm a white woman with white hair and glasses in front of a blurred background. And we're thrilled that you're here today and that we have Hannah Jayanti as our speaker. Our lecture series is a place where we bring people who are exploring new documentary forms, who are critiquing and creating with emerging technologies and using different practices such as co-creation to really explore the future of documentary. And today we have Mandy Rose as our moderator. Mandy is a professor of documentary and digital cultures at University of West England and also a fellow with the Open Documentary Lab. So I'm going to pass it to her. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, I'm Mandy, a white woman in her 60s with grey-brown hair sitting in front of a very bright yellow wall. I'm delighted that we're being joined today by documentary filmmaker, organizer and educator Hannah Jayanti for a talk entitled Documentary as Practice, Ethics and Politics Through Curiosity and Care. Hannah's work, and I'm quoting her, centers process-driven and formally expansive non-fiction as ethical and political practices of being in the world. Through this lens, she circles around questions of landscape, listening, memory and time. Her organizing work includes co-creating spaces that model mutual aid practices while creating surprising futures. As an educator, she focuses on mentorship and low-cost media training through non-fiction art spaces and community centres. So I came across Hannah's work when her 2020 film Truth or Consequences was premiered by Sheffield DocFest online during the early months of the COVID crisis. A speculative documentary, deftly framed as if in the very near future when space tourism is every day. The film spotlights 5 inhabitants of the New Mexico town, Truth or Consequences, zooming in on them as they reflect and make meaning from their often precarious lives. Drawing on volumetric capture and on archive material, the film speaks of the present, but also of deep time, and asks what kind of future we might be making. It's a delicate, luminous film with an improvised soundtrack by the great Bill Frisell, a film that deeply communicates an ethical relationship with its subjects and with the project of documentary. It was a revelation to me and a deeply sustaining cultural experience in those anxious days of lockdown. So Truth or Consequences is available now, and we'll put some links into the chat, and I basically insist you all watch it as soon as possible. So since then, Hannah's been making a number of works in a variety of formats within the umbrella project Topography, and through these asking pressing questions about how we might reinvent and repair documentary practice for these turbulent times. She's interrogating and reflecting on her work as a practice-based PhD researcher in the Department of Film and Digital Media at UC Santa Cruz. So Hannah's going to talk for 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be a Q&A. So as Sarah said, do please put your questions in the chat, or if you prefer, you can raise your digital hand once questions begin. So just remains to say thank you so much, Hannah, for joining us and for willingly sharing your work in progress at what I know is a busy time in your schedule. I'm so looking forward to catching up with what you've been doing and thinking. So over to you.
Thank you, Mandy. That was such a beautiful introduction. And thank you all for being here. So I'll describe myself and then I'll introduce the talk. So I'm a light-skinned person wearing a V-neck black t-shirt. I have a nose ring and earrings, and I have medium length dark brown hair, and I'm sitting in a wooden loft that is my office. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. All right. Again, thank you, Mandy, for moderating. I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with you again. Thank you to Sarah for inviting me, to Akmarat for all the producing work that you've done. These series take so much behind the scenes work that is often invisible. So thank you all for everything that you've done to make this happen. I'm going to get started by telling you a little bit about myself and my work, and then some of the philosophies and processes that guide it. For accessibility, I'm also going to briefly describe the videos and images that I show throughout this presentation. Right now, we're seeing slow motion video of murky light green water with reflections and refractions, and a GoPro camera slowly being pulled out of the water, emerging with algae on it. All right, so my name is Hannah Jayanti, and as mentioned, I think of myself as a documentary filmmaker, organizer, and educator. I work in a variety of formats, including feature films, such as The Badlands, which is a film that I'm currently working on. It's currently in production. And it's set in the Badlands of southwestern South Dakota, which is a landscape that has been sculpted by erosion, militarization, dispossession, and preservation, among other things. The film spends time with a multiplicity of people who are engaged with the land through very different perspectives. So we spend time with paleontologists, ecologists, tribal members, ranchers, military historians, tourists, foragers, and rangers. And through their experiences, the film reveals the historical and political forces that have shaped this landscape and thereby so many American landscapes. And the film does this in order to try to find cracks and openings for imagining futures based in environmental justice and ecological restoration. Right now, we're seeing a teaser for the film, which includes landscape shots of the Badlands, craggy and dramatic spires, leading into up-close documentary shots of people, plants, animals, and those engaging with the landscape, including foragers, birders, and conservationists. Other feature films include what Mandy was so generously describing, which is Truth or Consequences, which visits with 5 people living in the town of Truth or Consequences, which is a small desert town in southern New Mexico. The film is, again, as Mandy mentioned, what we lovingly call a speculative documentary. And what we mean by that is because although everything in the film is documentary footage, nothing is made up, nothing is staged, the editing subtly sets the film in a near future, and that's a future when commercial space travel has started to happen. And this speculative premise is based on a documentary reality, and that is that the town of Truth or Consequences is the closest town to Spaceport America, which is the world's first custom-built commercial spaceport. So the film is accompanied by time traveling through archives and into future memories, but is really grounded by the presence of 5 people who are finding meaning and groundedness on Earth and in their lives. And those people are Olin, Katie, Philip, George, and Yvonne. Right now we're seeing the trailer for the film, which includes shots of the town and the main people we'll meet. This leads into archival footage, present-day landscapes of the desert, footage of people visiting the spaceport, archival material detailing the history of the spaceport, and lineages of progress in the area, and documentary sequences in the lives of the people in the town. And this is Yvonne, who is a very special person. I also work in performance, such as Strata, which is a live edited documentary performance where my partner and collaborator, Alexander Porter, and I improvise a call and response between a virtual landscape and documentary footage. The performance is set in meticulously rendered 3D scan of an 80-foot region in the Badlands of South Dakota, which you can see in this footage. And the land is revealed through a chorus of diverse perspectives on the land. And over the course of the performance, part of what happens, or at least we hope happens, is that this very tiny piece of land is revealed to be a vast and verdant terrain that is filled with stories and histories and memories and observations. One thing you'll notice is that we often work iteratively, creating multi-platform projects that don't just exist in one format. As you can probably tell, the Strata performance that you're seeing here shares material and location with the Badlands film. And right now we're also creating an installation based out of these materials. So right now we're seeing documentation of the performance, starting with shots of myself and Alexander on a dark stage at computers. This leads into foggy virtual landscape, which we descend into, intercut with up-close documentary footage, including animals, people, and archival objects, such as historical photographs, like this one. I also work in installation. I mentioned that we're turning the Strata performance into an installation, and it also includes Fire Island, which is a 3-channel video installation. And this project really explores the impulses and tensions between preservation and change. It's set on Fire Island, which is a barrier island off the coast of Long Island in New York. And Fire Island is a landscape in motion. It's constantly changing. You can go out one day and the sand dunes that you saw yesterday look very different. The film captures a variety of people who are engaging with the landscape, including a park ranger who leads tours to find her demolished home in the sand dunes, and she can never really find it because they're changing so often. A scientist who tracked deer in the only federally designated wilderness in New York State, a man who carves a campground out of the encroaching vines, and a couple, Alexander and I, who recreate our home amidst streams of loss and change. So right now we're seeing documentation of the installation with 3 screens in a big empty room with wooden floors. The images on the 3 screens change, and they include a man's face, a 3D model of a house, the beach, the waves, and people in the landscape. Community projects are also core to my practice, and I consider them part of the documentary practice. And they often take the shape of collaborations with the people we're filming with. So this is a book proposal that we're currently working on, which will be a plant guidebook. And it's titled Guide to Lakota Traditional Plant Use. And it's a project that's led by our collaborator, Richard T. Sherman, who is a renowned ethnobotanist, a Lakota ethnobotanist in the Badlands. And the book is based on his lifelong work with edible and medicinal plants in the Great Plains. Right now, we're seeing a sample page from a proposal for a book project that shows an orange flower and information, including habitat, harvest, method, food prep, and other details. Another example of a community project is Meteoric, which is a free and public arts festival in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. In 2018, a group of us gathered together artists from Truth or Consequences and around the world and started having long conversations about what we wanted for ourselves and our communities. And from this, we co-created Meteoric. And we very idealistically and I think quite beautifully considered it to be dedicated to re-envisioning what a community-led festival could be. It was created through a horizontal and decentralized curation where artists were given an open invitation to design their participation. So we would ask people, if you could make, show, or create something deeply unconstrained, what would you do? And we would also ask them, how can you use this festival to create something that you've always been dreaming of? And what resulted were new and old works, experiences, and presentations that spanned across conventional categories, including films, installations, aerial performances, knife forging, poetry, collective dinners, public forums, interviews, sculpture, music, and much more. The festival continues to this day in ever-changing and non-hierarchical collaborations between artists. We're seeing documentation from the festival, including people installing sculptures, dancing, performing, watching films, engaging with public art, and enjoying each other's company. All right. So as a filmmaker, I direct, produce, shoot, edit, and do sound, often working collaboratively with a small team. This is a video of me filming in the Badlands with spire-like rocks all around, a large camera on my shoulder, and the person I'm filming with who's wearing a national park uniform. I often film handheld with a relatively small and portable setup. Here I have a shoulder rig and a Sony FS5 camera and 2 audio inputs, a lavalier and a shotgun, which is usually how I film. And in this case, for the Badlands film, I'm using a 400mm zoom lens, which I find very funny to film documentary scenes with because I can't tell what's going on a lot of the time. It's just very hard to see the big picture when you're filming with a lens that big. And so I find that I'm endlessly trying to find focus, which feels both literal and somehow metaphorical. My main collaborator is Alexander Porter, who is an artist working with experimental photographic techniques, such as 3D scanning and volumetric capture. His work involves applying what can often be very alienating techniques that have histories of surveillance and militarization to humane topics such as environmental justice, mental health, urbanism, and ecology. Here he is 3D scanning a fossil on a rocky crag at sunset with the Badlands landscape surrounding him. One of my favorite of Alexander's pieces, which he directed and I collaborated on as a documentary interviewer and editor, is called Blackout. Blackout is a virtual reality documentary that's set on the New York City subway. The film is generative, and the narrative is determined by the viewer's body. In other words, who you choose to go close to and who you look at. Accompanied by a physical installation, you can walk around, lean against a pole, sit down next to virtual passengers. And when the train leaves the station, you learn that you can hear their thoughts. And the narrative really rewards listening. It rewards deep listening. So the more you listen to someone, the more that you'll learn about their lives. And it's generative. Every experience is unique, and every train has different passengers. And this was created using volumetric filmmaking, which is a technique pioneered by Alexander and his collaborators. And the audio is from long-form documentary interviews that I conducted with over 50 New Yorkers from all walks of life. We're watching a trailer of the film that shows the virtual train car with people inside who look both digital and realistic. And intercut are shots of the installation space, which is white and minimalist looking. And people are wearing VR headsets. All right, I think I have to drink a little bit of tea in my Badlands cup. This is a cup from the Badlands. Okay. Alexander and I have been working together for many years. He's my partner in life and in work, and he will be a presence throughout much of what I present today. And right now we're looking at a 360 video of us sitting on a rock formation in the Badlands, and we're being affectionate towards each other. And I find this video embarrassingly cute, and I only mildly regret including it in this presentation. Okay, so that is an overview of some of our work. I think this has sound in it, which I was not expecting. Can everyone still hear me okay, even with the sound coming through? Okay, maybe it's calming. So we're looking at a video of a sun flare coming through the leaves of a tree that are moving in the wind. And my hope is this is a soothing image to look at while I talk a bit. So what I showed is just a small selection of my and our work. And there's lots more to say about each of these projects, and there's lots of other projects that I haven't mentioned, but I'm hoping that this gives you a good overview of what we do. For the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on the philosophies and the questions and the processes that guide the work, because for me, the how and the why are really what I care most about. I consider myself to be a deeply process-driven filmmaker, and a lot of my work is actually about the methodologies of filmmaking as a life practice. And that is that's the core of what this talk is hoping to be about. I personally believe that documentary as a practice can open up remarkable ways of being in the world that can center care, mutuality, and presence. And I see all of my work, whether it's filmmaking, teaching, organizing, collaborating, or even just being in the world, as trying to use documentary as a practice to create more spaces and interactions and projects and relationships that are centered around ethical practices, political engagement, community collaboration, and transformative self-expression. So to center my talk, I want to start with a quote from anthropologist Tim Ingold, We're looking at a light green background with white letters that show the name of the author, and soon we'll show the title of the article and the quotes that I'm going to be reading. In a lovely article called Art, Science, and the Meaning of Research from 2018, Ingold compares the research of artists to the research of scientists. And too simplistically, in my opinion, he says that scientists are like mountaineers, that they're always looking for the next summit. And he criticizes scientists for considering the world to be static, considering it to be a terra incognito that needs to be discovered and conquered, where the goal is to move the unknown into the known and to place things on a map. In contrast, he presents artists as hill walkers. So scientists are mountaineers and artists are hill walkers. And artists aren't trying to conquer and reach the peaks, but they are instead delighting in the same path over and over and over again. And again, I think this is a very simplistic sense of scientists and artists, but I find it helpful for articulating a certain way of being in the world. So Ingold sees artists as particularly practiced in seeing newness amongst sameness and working relationally in ways that open up questions. And one of the things I love is he writes about research as literally meaning to search again and to find again. That it's not about turning something unknowable into knowledge, but it's about finding and refining again. And that in itself is a pursuit of truth. So Ingold writes, curiosity in research is a practice of care. And he goes on to say, and it's a slightly long quote, but I find it very grounding, things we study begin to tell us how to observe. In allowing ourselves into their presence, rather than holding them at arm's length, in attending to them, we find that they are also guiding our attention. Our eyes and ears, hands and minds, absorb into their ways of working a perceptual acuity attuned to their particular ways of moving, of feeling, and of being. Attending to these ways, we also respond to them as they respond to us. Research then becomes a practice of correspondence. It is through corresponding with things that we care for them. It is a labor of love, giving back what we owe to the world for our own existence as beings within it. Research as correspondence, in this sense, is not just what we do, but what we undergo. I want to pull out a few words here to guide the rest of the presentation. Care, attuned, practice, labor of love, and not just what we do, but what we undergo. And I want to tell 2 anecdotes that illustrate how I understand our approach in relationship to care, attunement, practices, love, and what we undergo as practitioners doing this work. So the anecdote number 1 is Alexander in VR, Alexander in the virtual world. And thank you, Alexander, for letting me share this story of yours. As I mentioned, in Truth or Consequences, the film includes sequences that are filmed in virtual reality worlds. And these were created by Alexander. So Alexander painstakingly extracted individual frames from documentary footage that I had shot. And this allowed him to create 3D models of places in the film, such as Yvonne's trailer. So we're looking at a video from the end of the film, which takes place in a virtual reality reconstruction of Yvonne's trailer. Against a dark background, the room appears ethereal with point cloud dots, hauntingly revealing her living room. In the corner of the image, a smaller inset video shows the original documentary footage of Yvonne sitting on her couch and smoking a cigarette. He also recreated George's museum. And we're looking at a virtual reality reconstruction of George's museum, which then cuts to live footage of his space, which is filled with objects. So hopefully you can tell that the documentary footage was the source material, and then Alexander created these virtual worlds from that source material. He also recreated Main Street, We're looking at a virtual reality reconstruction of Main Street and the front of the grocery store, again, while a smaller video inset shows the original documentary footage. Alexander then put these 3D models into the game engine Unity and built custom recording software that allowed us to put on virtual reality headsets and walk around while filming inside the worlds. The sequences in the film are first-person point of view recordings of us walking around what felt like a very strange but familiar world. And we've described these as creatively misusing photogrammetry, photogrammetry being a technique that creates 3D models from images, as the documentary footage was not created for this. It's really just footage that I was filming regardless of this. And then Alexander had to custom build software and workflows to build these worlds. So we're looking at a virtual reality reconstruction of Main Street, while a smaller video inset shows Alexander walking in a studio with a VR headset on. So while building these new workflows, Alexander developed, and I'm telling a story that he told me, but he developed a deep intimacy to these places. He would tell me about how, in order to stitch together a single scene, like the one you're seeing, he'd have to track the location of one small detail over thousands of frames. So the writing on a pillow, and I know this video is a little dark, I'm not sure why it's so dark, but the writing on a pillow, the eyeball in a framed photograph, a certain mark on a wall that no one else may have ever noticed. So we'd be tracking that small detail over thousands and thousands of frames. And we had this remarkable moment when Alexander came back to Truth or Consequences for the Meteoric Festival, and he told me that he felt such a deeper connection to the place than when he'd first visited. This time around, he knew all these tiny details. He knew the shape of a gutter on a building, the corner molding in Olin's house, or the leaves on Main Street. We're looking at a longer video of the virtual reality reconstruction of Yvonne's trailer. The techniques Alexander had used demanded an attentiveness and a care that allowed him to re-see the place through the deep attention and attunement that his art-making practice required. The technological process and the mediation, which can so often create separation, instead, for Alexander, created a heightened presence in the world. The world became an even richer place of details, of small beauties, and of things to notice. His practice created an increased sensitivity to the place, people, and the non-humans that inhabit it. We're looking at documentary footage from the town, including details such as a cat in a window, a flag in front of a trailer, a wasp behind a window curtain, a cactus with some fabric in the wind. And that's the end of anecdote 1. All right, now we're looking at, again, at a light green background with white letters that show the name of the author and soon the title of the article and the quotes I'm going to be reading. Natalie Lovelace writes in a book called How to Make Art at the End of the World, something that maybe we all have to be thinking about. And the book is about research creation, which is an academic approach to research that pairs art making with more traditional scholarly research. It's very much the ethos of the PhD program that I'm in at UC Santa Cruz, the practice-led PhD program that I'm in. In the book, Lovelace makes an impassioned case for the importance of treating art practices as knowledge production. So often art is considered to be a way of representing an idea or illustrating something that we already know. And Lovelace is arguing for art to actually be seen as a way of creating new configurations of knowledge that come about through the practice of making art. In referencing Donna Haraway and Thomas King, Natalie writes, quote, "Both authors, both Donna Haraway and Thomas King, implicitly insist that to do research of any kind is not simply to ask questions. It is to let our curiosities drive us and allow them to ethically bind us. It is to tell stories and to pay attention not only to which stories we are telling and how they are telling them, but how they, through their very forms, are telling us. She goes on to say that their work, quote, implicitly argues that it is in allowing ourselves to be drawn by our loves, and I love that she uses the word love, our intensive and extensive curiosities, attentive to what and whom we are driven to explore, and examining the complex web of relations that we inherit thereby, that we might inhabit research questions ethically. So what strikes me about these quotes is that there is a relationship between love and attention. And there's a relationship between love and attention and research. And there's a relationship between love, attention, research, and ethics. And there's a relationship between all of these and the complex web of relationships that we share. So back to Alexander and I's practice. Alexander is what I consider to be a compulsive scanner. He's just always scanning. This is a video of Alexander setting up lights in order to 3D scan a fossil. This is in the Badlands, in the Paleo Lab in the Badlands. And in the same way as I consider myself to be a compulsive filmer, this is a video of me filming an anthill in the Badlands, and they're all like getting in my boots because for some reason I've rolled up my trousers. I don't know why. And so you see me hopping around. When Alexander and I are working on a project, we film and scan endlessly. And we often don't know exactly why or what we're looking for. It feels like a very intuitive process. And we have a practice of actually trying to not enter places with a preconceived idea of what we're hoping to find. So we specifically go in without trying to find something that's already set, and instead try to build the narrative based on the place. And this involves spending a ton of time in the places that we film and spending a lot of time listening to what people choose to share and trying as best we can to understand what matters to them. We're now watching the rest of the teaser for the Badlands documentary, which includes additional vignettes of people engaging with the landscape, including conservationists, ranchers, rangers, paleontologists, and more. So, for example, Alexander and I didn't set out to make a film about land use, which is what much of the Badlands film explores. We care very deeply about the environment and the histories that shape it, but we didn't go out seeking to make an environmental film. What happened was we did an arts residency at Badlands National Park for 2.5 months, and we fell in love with the place and the people, and we kept coming back. While we were there, especially during that first 2.5 months, we would ask people what we should film, and more often than not, they would invite us to walk the land with them. That was usually what they wanted to do. They would invite us to map prairie dog towns, to spotlight for black-footed ferrets, which you saw some footage of in the teaser, to see the indentations of their grandparents' sod house, who were settlers, to visit a decommissioned nuclear missile silo that's in the middle of their pasture, to find 32-million-year-old fossils, or visit the boundary between the Pine Ridge Reservation and US federal land. These are the kinds of things people invited us to do with them. And unlike earlier films that I had made, people rarely suggested filming indoors, and they were not very interested in telling us about their personal backstories or individual narratives. And if you've seen Truth or Consequences, that's like the whole film. I mean, there's other things about it, but it's really like a deep dive into people sharing their stories. And so for me as a filmmaker, I was like, oh no, what do we do if no one's sharing their personal stories? But what they wanted to talk about is they wanted to talk about the land. And so the Badlands film is about the land because that is what people we spent time with centered while we were there. That's what they told us about. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they care most about, but that's what they chose to tell us about while we were there. So for me, this is how I understand us, in the words of Natalie Lovelace, as letting our curiosities drive us and allow them to ethically bind us. For me, this is how we allow ourselves to be drawn by our loves, our intensive and extensive curiosities, attentive to what and whom we are driven to explore, and examining the complex web of relationships that we inherit thereby. So I don't want to advocate that everyone works in this way, and I don't want to suggest that it's the right way to make films. It's a practice that we've built that is appropriate for how we work, for the films that we want to make, the situations we gravitate towards, and the people that we collaborate with. There are so many different approaches, so many different kinds of films, and so many different intentions for what films can do in the world, the kind of work they can do in the world. However, I do really want to advocate for the idea that this way of working can be considered political and ethical approaches, and that these are political and ethical approaches that matter. And here I evoke a Donna Haraway quote from Staying with the Trouble, when she writes, quote, "It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots knot knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories." Donna Haraway is at UC Santa Cruz, and I see her talk quite often, and she talks exactly like she writes, and it's kind of amazing. So I would argue that it matters to work in some of the ways that I'm sharing because it has material reality in the world in so many ways. So while I don't want to advocate for my particular way of working, I very strongly want to advocate that people making documentary projects consider how their filmmaking can be a practice for being in the world, and one that is attuned to the values of the project, the values of the people making the project, and the values of the community that they're collaborating with. All right, this brings me to my second anecdote, which is called Hannah in the Badlands. We're looking at raw footage of me filming with Richard in the Badlands. This is Richard, who I spoke about earlier. And we're first looking at plants together, and then there's an informal interview at the top, including a close-up on his face. And you also get to see all my totally imperfect filming. Okay, so in this story, the story takes place in July of 2021, and Alexander and I are out hiking with Richard T. Sherman. And Richard is a key collaborator in the film, and he, as I mentioned, he's the creator of the plant guidebook that we saw earlier. This was only our second time filming with him, so we were still becoming friends. And on this day, he invited us to look for plants on Sheep Mountain Table, which is a plateau in the South Unit of Badlands National Park, which is a section of the park that is located on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is sovereign nation of the Oglala Lakota. And it's one of Richard's favorite places. He's hunted, foraged, hiked, and camped in almost every parts, as far as I can tell, in the over 80 years that he's lived there. So as we're walking around, he's sharing about the plants. He's sharing how this one cures rashes, how this other one can be burned to help with asthma, how this one can be used as toilet paper, how that one can be made in a tea. And before we got up to Sheep Mountain Table on the drive, not on the drive up, I think sometime earlier, I can't remember when, he had told me that when he was a child, the US Air Force had bombed this part of the reservation. So and what had happened was that they had displaced families in a very short time in order to turn it into a gunnery range. So when I heard that story, it felt very paradigmatic to me. You know, it felt like a exemplary story about US violence and settler colonialism in action. So when we're walking around together, I find that story is in the back of my mind, and I can tell that I'm kind of eager to ask about that story. And I'm eager to get it on film. I can just, there's a little part of my brain that's like, oh, got to get that on camera. And so, Richard is very invested in sharing the Lakota history of the area, but what he's really invested in is pointing out plants and making jokes and taking photographs and teasing us. That's like his main goal for our time together. But part of what happens in the footage that you're seeing is that we go up to this very picturesque overlook, and I think, oh, now's my moment. And I ask him to stop. And I focus my camera on him and I start asking him about the bombing range. And Richard is a very generous person and he obliges and starts telling me stories. But relationally, there's a shift. There's a change that happens between us. And I can tell that he's less at ease. You know, his sort of posture changes, his tone becomes very serious. It just becomes much more formal. You know, he's no longer at ease. And I can also kind of tell that he's starting to tell stories that he's said before for the camera. And it might be hard to tell from the footage, but the dynamic changes. And what I begin to sense, for myself at least, is that we start playing well-worn parts. And those well-worn parts are that I'm the documentary filmmaker from New York who is prying into trauma, and he's an Indigenous person telling me of the wrongs done to his community. So I tell this story for a few reasons. One is that I believe that moments like this are so prevalent in documentary practice that we barely notice or distinguish them. I think that they're the ideological water within which we swim. The second reason I tell this story is that I believe, personally, from my own experience, that this comes from a kind of embedded conditioning, an understanding of what story is, of what capturing means, or of what you need for the film. In other words, what I would call the tenets of good documentary filmmaking, which are inherited from a whole host of sociopolitical heritages. And I tell this for a third reason, which is that the important part for me is that relation and presence were broken at that moment. Before, we were a group of friends filming and very much being led by what he wanted to tell us. And I interrupted that and created a different dynamic because I needed it, because I felt like I needed it for the sake of the film. So we're looking at a light green background with white letters that show the name of the author and soon the title of the article and the quotes I'm going to be reading. There's a wonderful book called Hungry Listening by Dylan Robinson, and it traces colonial forms of listening in contrast to Indigenous listening practices. Within the framework of his book, I personally believe that Robinson might categorize the experience I just shared as hungry listening. Robinson writes, hungry listening gathers and instrumentalizes content that is heard. And Robinson goes on to say, quote, hungry listening consumes without awareness of how the consumption acts in relationship with those people, the lands, the waters who provide sustenance. Moving beyond hungry listening towards anti-colonial listening practices requires that the, quote, fevered pace of consumption for knowledge resources be placed aside in favor of new temporalities of wonder, disoriented from anti-relational and non-situated settler colonial positions of certainty. So within Robinson's critique, I think that you can find traces of other ways of listening through new temporalities, through wonder, through relationality, and through situatedness. So now we're looking at a video of seagrasses in the water, gently moving with the tides. And again, I'm showing this image as a hopefully soothing image while I talk. So telling that story about Richard does not feel comfortable for me. It feels risky and vulnerable and messy. But personally, I go to too many artist talks and panels where people talk about how retrospectively they did such a good job in contrast to all those other people who are doing extractive, problematic filmmaking. And personally, I believe that documentary is just too intertwined in the relations of the world. It's too intertwined between people, between subject and object, between structures, between apparatuses of surveillance and images of representational violence. It's just too intertwined in all these things to be innocent or to be a project that some people are doing right. Personally, I prefer to see documentary as a fertile space of contestation. I see it as a place where we can grapple with how we want to be towards ourselves, each other, and the world we all share. Personally, I believe it's a practice that has tremendous possibility, precisely because it tempts us. And it tempts us around the things that are pervasive and in our lives and in our societies. Things like the desire to have power over the other, the need for control, the pursuit of outcomes regardless of the process that it takes to get there. So documentary is powerful, I believe, because it confronts us in these ways, but contains within it the possibility for counteracting these tendencies and trying in community, in action, and with others to model other ways of being in the world. The last reason that I chose to share the story of myself and Richard in the Badlands is to remind us and to remind myself that it actually takes something to center ethical and political practices. Some people might find it easy and common sense, but in my experience from talking to other filmmakers, from my mentoring work and making my own films, it really takes something. It takes something to notice when one has started being an extractive weirdo in situations that used to be based around friendship and curiosity. And then it takes something to course correct in those moments. It takes something to build documentary projects where the how the film is made and the how it communicates its material are in line with the politics of the film's content, the politics of what it's about. It takes something to make work that is really hard to describe in grant applications. It takes something to contest our own internalized sense of how things should be. One of the things I struggled the most with was actually how to get that voice outside of my own body and mind. And it takes something to reorient away from the lineages of colonization and othering representations that are foundational to documentary. And it takes something to reorient oneself towards the often erased, but the wonderfully robust lineages of documentary practice, which center community, care, attention, activism, and reinvention. So I want to end on a quote, but before I do, I want to mention other collaborators who have worked on the projects that I've spoken about today. There are more here than I can mention, but they have all contributed deeply. Right now, we're looking at a slide with a list of names of contributors organized by the projects that they collaborated on. I spoke about a lot of this work as if it was my work, but this is the work that is a group of people working in different ways, asking questions, contributing extraordinarily. All right, so my end quote. We're looking at a light green background with white letters that show the name of the author, and soon we'll show the quote. So my final quote comes from a correspondence that I had with a dear friend of mine, Jules Roskam, who's a brilliant filmmaker. And last year, I think it might have been 2 years ago, for 4 months, we wrote to each other every week. And the only principle was that we would include an image and something written as a response to what the other person had posted. So there was no, that was very open. And I think in retrospect, I see it as our own form of this responsive correspondence centered around curiosity and care. I sort of feel like we were being hill walkers together, in the words of Tim Ingold. And during 1 week, he wrote to me about the emergent nature of the utopian and how instead of being temporally located in the future, rather than now, or physically located somewhere else other than here, he sees the utopian as, in his words, quote, action-oriented, active, and only exists between us. It's inherently relational, emergent, and risky, end quote. So that's Jules writing about his understanding of the utopian. And in thinking through the pain and the beauty that this kind of utopianism entails, Jules went on to quote Judith Butler in giving an account of oneself, which I'm going to requote here as a note to end on. Quote, "We must recognize that ethics requires us to risk ourselves, precisely at moments of unknowingness. when what forms us diverges from what lies before us, when our willingness to become undone in relation to others constitutes our chance of becoming human. To be undone by another is a primary necessity, an anguish to be sure, but also a chance. To be addressed, claimed, bound to what is not me, but also to be moved, to be prompted to act, to address myself elsewhere, and so to vacate the self-sufficient, quote, I as a kind of possession. If we speak to give an account from this place, we will not be irresponsible, or if we are, we will surely be forgiven. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for a really beautiful talk, and one that I certainly welcome hugely, and I'm sure others here today will welcome hugely. So many interesting strands of thinking in there, but also just such a pleasure to be kind of tuning us in to those themes within documentary practice, those themes of attunement, of care, of practice, of love, and to be thinking about, what curiosity, thinking about how we can work with our curiosity, go with that curiosity as an ethical, in an ethical way, and as an ethical spur. So I'm just thinking about where to go first in terms of asking questions of you. I mean, I'm very interested in the way you think about iterative as a kind of core, an iterative approach as kind of core to your practice. And I wondered if perhaps first you might talk a little bit about that and about how you start these conversations and how you take them forward. I mean, I was talking earlier this afternoon to a group of PhD students about ethics, and I was talking about transparency. But it's challenging, isn't it, to be transparent when actually you're not quite sure where it's going to go, and you need that iterative process to go to work through. So I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit about beginnings of projects and the shapes that they take within this iterative framework?
That's a good question. I mean, I think Alexander might be better at answering some of these questions, but I'm just going to say some things that came to mind with your question. One is that Alexander and I, with our collaborators, do quite a lot of work, and I often feel a little cheesy speaking about it, but we do a lot of work trying to understand what the commitments of the project are. And we'll often do like kind of design-like processes where we try to understand what is this project actually about. And I think I mentioned this when we talked last time, Mandy, but so for Truth or Consequences, we discovered or articulated that the film was about listening. And that became our compass for everything. I mean, I had like a sticky of it on my computer. It would be whenever I would get lost in the edit, I would try to ask myself, am I listening? It became the reason that we did the Meteoric project. We were like, oh no, we haven't been listening to people, and so that would be one answer, is that we try to understand the core commitment and actually have that lead what we do, which I think is quite unusual. Like I think often you think you start with what to do and then figure out the why. So that's maybe one answer. In terms of sort of formats and iterativeness, I think that, I mean, I really learned that after Truth or Consequences. I was not working that way before. And I think a lot of that goes to Alexander, his credit, and a lot of our collaborators, people who are much more versed in immersive media, much more versed in the idea that things can live in many different ways. Personally, I actually found that quite hard to think through as a documentary filmmaker. Like I was just like, but we make the movies. And so that actually took it actually took quite a lot of opening up my mind for that. And but one thing I did feel like at the end of Truth or Consequences, I could just tell I had a kind of malaise about starting the whole um process of making a film, pitching it, raising money. Like, I was just like, there's something about that, not showing anybody material of our movie for 5 years and then putting it out. It was just so demoralizing to me somehow.
Mm.
And so Alexander and I started talking about what it would be like to try to make a project where we didn't have to do that. And so we had a chance, we were invited to do a work in progress at the Museum of the Moving Image. And we were like, what if we just did a performance? And and then we got so excited because we got to just show a bunch of the footage before it was done and talk about it with people. And I think, yeah, at least for me, that really opened up the space, the idea that I don't know, the process, particularly the production process of documentaries could be really different.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered your question, but those are the
Yeah,
things.
no, well, it certainly responded to it. Yes, yes. So, I guess there was something else I was thinking about because you've used this expression, documentary as kind of contestation, and in a way, if I'm hearing you right, I'm thinking that has to do with documentary as a critical practice vis-a-vis, the world around us, our shared world. And I'm thinking about that in relation to the kind of deeply collaborative works that you do, wondering perhaps about Badlands, because you talked about the cast, the people involved in Badlands being very diverse. And I wonder if you find a tension between that business of documentary as contestation, as critical practice, and the documentary as collaborative practice, how that kind of works, how you handle that tension, if you find a tension there.
Would you mind reiterating that a little bit for me?
Yes, no, fine. So when you speak about documentary as contestation, I hear documentary in its kind of traditional sense of documentary as a critical practice vis-a-vis our shared world. And I guess I'm wondering, with a project like Badlands, where you've got quite a diverse group of collaborators who may think very different things about our shared world, whether there's a tension there that you're having to kind of work your way through between collaborators, who have different points of view on the
Yeah.
subject matter.
Yeah, interesting. Um, Interesting. So I think I have to think about this a little bit more.
Mhm.
And I think,
Yeah.
one thing I was talking to you about before this talk is that, as you mentioned, I'm in a PhD program and
Mhm.
I'm a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is about understanding the relationship between practice and theory
Mm, mm,
in the way that I work and also the way that those two things can work together.
mhm,
And so some of this is stuff that I'm really actually grappling with right now.
mhm,
So a lot of
mhm,
what I presented to you today is early articulations of ideas that I'm
mhm,
trying to
mhm,
learn more about. So by the
mhm,
way, for anyone out there, if you have contributions, I would love to hear them because I'm
mhm,
really trying to learn more
mhm.
about this world.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
so I think one thing I would say is when I think about contestation, I think I'm thinking a lot about an internal experience.
Mhm,
I think
mhm,
I'm I think I'm thinking about moments where you could go one way or you could go other way. I think this is why I think about it as a practice, is it feels like there's just tons and tons of little moments. And the sum of those moments can be one kind of bit way of being in the world or another kind of way of being in the world, but they're very small little moments.
mhm,
And at least for me, like if I didn't course correct at times, I would make a very different kind of film and I would be very different towards people I'm working with.
mhm,
So I
mhm,
think I'm thinking about contestation in that way. And for me, it's very generative to think about it again as a site where that can happen,
mhm, mhm,
a very
mhm,
generative site where that can happen.
mhm,
Um, and then in terms of the question about collaborative practices, I don't know if this is exactly what you're getting at, but for the Badlands, we're spending time with people that have very different histories and very different levels of power and placement in the world. So, for example, we spend time with ranchers who are the great-grandchildren of settlers in South Dakota and own huge tracts of land.
Mhm.
And then we're also spending time with people who have been displaced by some of that history, let's say.
Mhm.
And one of the things that the film, I'm sort of in a rough cut stage of the film, so I don't know how this is going to work exactly yet. But one of the things I do think about is how do you honor these people's perspectives, but not collapse the different power structures. How can you really listen? Like, how can I really listen to these ranchers, but not forget the structural frameworks with which they live? And how can I make a film that can do both? Like, what does that actually look like? And I'm not sure I totally know. I think for the Badlands film in particular, one of the ways we've been doing it is that we center a writing that Richard made, which is Richard wrote a book called, he developed an Indigenous stewardship model.
Mhm.
And the Indigenous stewardship model that he made is a guide that centers the idea that multiplicity of knowledges can coexist at the same time. And it's specifically a work that tries to think about how the federal government can work with Indigenous tribes around land stewardship. And he has this beautiful phrase, which he says, imagine a world where all knowledge systems are respected. And that would be a world that would not be the capitalistic settler colonial world, which has to destroy other types of knowledges in order to have a kind of dominance. So I've been trying to center that commitment. Maybe that's that's one of the commitments of the film, is what would it look like if to live in that kind of world. And so and I don't totally know what that's going to look like in the film visually yet. That's one of the big things I have to find out.
Sure. Well, we'll look forward to seeing how that emerges. But all of these questions that you're grappling with seem so fundamental to the business of rethinking, of repairing, of looking towards a kind of post-colonial documentary practice, and a documentary practice that can, yes, respond to the multiplicity of knowledges, rather than kind of come from, directed by the kind of the masterful director who, isn't prepared to reflect deeply about their own position in the documentary making process. So, well, I'd welcome anyone who has a question, either pop it in the chat or raise your digital hand, and I'll come to you. We can see you if you have your hand up. Somebody, yes, Daphne. So we're gonna unmute you. Akmirat, can you help me? Oh, Daphne, can you unmute yourself?
I have, yes. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
cool.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hello from Greece, everyone. Thank you very much for this, Hannah and Mandy. I'd like to ask you, how much time do you spend with the people that you meet before you start filming? How do you approach them? What do you tell them? How much do you share beforehand, before starting making the film? Obviously you don't know how the film is going to look like, when it's going to be out, these commitments that you mentioned. How much of this do you share with them, and when do you start filming, and how do you, build a sort of relationship, I guess, with them before you start the actual filming process? Because it probably takes some, time and stages. It doesn't happen in like one or two visits.
Thanks for that question, Daphne. Thanks for joining us from Greece. That's so great. So it really depends. So Yvonne, who you saw a little bit of in the teaser from Truth or Consequences, Yvonne, I was filming a fiddler's dance every Saturday night. A group of people dances and plays fiddles in Truth or Consequences. So I was filming that, and Yvonne was doing the tickets for it. And somehow she decided she wanted to help me. And so she started like getting releases from people, and she just thought it was like so sweet. And she kept being like, "You go, girl." It's like she doesn't talk like that, so I don't know why she was talking to me like that. Um, and then so we talked a bit afterwards, and she left a note in my bag that just said like, "Keep going." I don't know why she was so supportive of me. Um, and so then I asked, I was like, "Can I get back in touch with you?" And then I got back in touch with her, I think the second time that I saw that I was back in town. And I brought my camera right away because she just totally knew what was up. She probably knew better than I did at that point what I was doing. And so we just every time we hung out, I had my camera. And the one thing that does happen is that we always ask people what they want to do. So it's always like, what do you want to do? What do you want to film? What are you doing? Can we join? And so most of the footage becomes, I mean, we're like we're very active, like we're calling people all the time and seeing people all the time. So it's not like we're waiting for people to come see us, but we are like, we're like a little pushy in some ways, but then we're like, what do you want to do? Because then some people are like, we don't want to, I don't want you to come. I don't want you to film. And then some people are like, yeah, just come wherever. And Yvonne, for example, she just didn't care less. She was stoked. She just wanted to hang out and film. And then and I think maybe that's part of what's important is that the people that you see in our films are people that wanted to spend time with us. And again, that's very different than other kinds of films, and also we're not doing exposés. We're not filming with like really powerful people. And that's a very different situation. That's like this way of working might not be appropriate for those situations. Like if you're making a film about Elon Musk or something, I do not suggest that you use our practices. Um, but but in this case, like, so for example, for Richard, and by the way, with Yvonne, I only filmed with her 2 days.
Wow.
And but it was just she was just so, I
Mhm.
mean, she was just amazing.
Hmm.
And then with Richard, we tell everyone as much as we know, which is often a bit ill-conceived in the beginning, but we're like, we tell them what I told you on here, like everyone seems to be talking to us about the land. What should we film here? What should we do? And Richard's like, let's go on walks and look at plants. And same with Richard, we filmed right at the beginning. But we spend a lot of time. I mean, I spend a lot of time with Richard, and a lot of times we're not filming. We spend a lot of time in the library now in Rapid City working on the book proposal. But in the beginning, I often do film a lot I do bring my camera. I think it's really healthy for us to all know that we're working on a project together.
Mm.
And yeah, so it's a slightly messy
Mm.
answer, but that's how I think about it.
And just to tease out a couple of things there then. So do you use the term collaborator? Do you declare we are collaborators on this project? Is that how you talk about it with people?
No, I actually think that assumes a lot, and I think it can
Mhm.
hide the fact that I have more control than they do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we often try to have conversations with them. So like we've had lots of conversations with Richard about how he wants to participate in this project.
Mhm.
Does he want to be considered a collaborator? If so, what does he want to do?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and then people collaborate in other ways. Like we have this
Yeah.
amazing friend, Wayne, who's a paleontologist in the Badlands, and he collaborates with us he lets us stay in his house for months at a time in the Badlands.
Mm.
So he's not giving us feedback on the film, but in my mind, he's a collaborator. But I think I would ask anyone that before I called them that, I guess, because again,
Yeah.
I think it just
Yeah.
flattens
Yeah.
power
Yeah.
structures that are actually there.
Sure. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. Now, I happen to know that AK is Anandana Kapoor because we had a little exchange in the chat. So Anandana, hi, it's really lovely to see you. So
Guys.
yeah, great to see you. So question to Hannah then.
Yes, thank you so much. It'll take me a while to figure out how to lower my hand, but I promise to do that. And Mandy, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you and Sarah and everybody at ODL. Hannah, thank you so much for that conversation. It was truly, I think, philosophical in a manner in which we sometimes cease to be when we're producing and making. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about co-presence, because you were talking about how you made films in a form, and then when you worked across genres, you started, and in fact, your crew members also started talking about what it means to pay more attention. So, how does that sort of play out in your writing and in how you approach your subjects? Like, how present are you? In what worlds are you present when you make? And I thought that curiosity and care kind of work between those two limits, as it were. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Can you describe a little more to me what you mean by presence in this case? Because I know what I mean, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
No, but I'd love to go with whatever you're thinking. I'd love to hear your take. Yeah.
That's a very generous question. Thank you. So I don't know. I think maybe this goes back a little bit to my conversation about contestation. I think when I started making films, and again, forgive me if this is not exactly what you're asking, but this is what showed up for me, is I think especially kind of in my late 20s, I discovered that I was sometimes a much better person when I was filming. I would listen better. Like I think I'm a pretty good listener in life, but I also just, I'm like, like Alexander will be trying to tell me something and I'll be doing a million things and I won't be that present. But with a camera in certain situations, I would really be able to honor someone's sharing. And one thing I noticed a lot about is that I just got very present to my own sense of attachments. So I think that story with Richard is partly something that I've just noticed in many places in my world where like I did this a lot with George in Truth or Consequences, where I would think that I needed to ask him something. And what I started to notice is anytime, and this is for me, I don't know what it's like for other people, but for me, anytime I started to get hooked on needing to get something, I became less present. And what that meant was that I was not really listening to them. Like I would be then maybe subtly trying to steer the conversation, or I had already had some decision about the role they were going to play in the film, or I wanted something. Basically, I wanted something from them. And I think this is why that Dylan Robinson quote is so helpful for me, because even though it's seemingly so subtle, I, in my body, experienced that as an extractive experience. And so the camera for me, and this again sounds so cheesy, but started to be a practice of presence. Can I, at those moments, interrupt that? Can I try to not do that? And if I try to not do that, what might happen? I think it's an exercise in like not being in control. Again, the things I kind of mentioned, it's an exercise in not taking the bait, like not taking the temptation. And yeah, so and I think I have experienced it as creating a huge difference in my life. Like this is why I think that documentary can be such a powerful model, is I can do that more now in other places. And so yeah, I think that's my experience, but I'm always like messing up and having to try again, like in the Badlands, I got really attached to the fact that people need to share their personal stories. I was like, but what are documentaries if people aren't sharing their personal stories? And I really had to work, and Alexander really had to work with me on like letting that go. That is not what people are doing here. So it feels like this is why I say practice, because I'm constantly having to notice where I've gotten attached, notice where that's getting in the way of something that I think is important, and then try to, and I will just add, like, I couldn't do it alone. Like I couldn't do it without other people that are reminding me of what the point of the project is. You know, like after the story with Richard, Alexander and I were in the car, and I was being really like bratty. And I was like, I was also mad at Alexander because he was talking a lot. And I was like, can't talk a lot because then we're gonna hear your voice. And it's just supposed to be Richard's voice. And Alexander was like, what are you talking about? Like, what is the point of this project? The point of this project is that you never hear anybody except for Richard talking? Or is the point of the project that we're out in the land with these people? You know, and like I really needed that to course correct. So I also think it's like it's just something you can't do alone. You have to have a community of people who are that we're all keeping each other accountable and growing and learning together.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I also feel that a part of like coexisting and co-presence is listening alongside. It's not just about listening to the person, but listening with them. And I think, what you're saying points to that as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Alan Dana. So Eddie, you have a question. So can you, hi there.
Hi. Hey, Hannah.
Hi, Eddie.
I'm playing hooky from student meetings to be here. Yeah, I guess my question, I wrote in the chat, but I feel like when you have these processes that are reflective and divergent or different, like I'm wondering just how much of this work has to be in the film, like the ethical questioning and the different apparatuses. And there's this paradox for me of like foregrounding this kind of ends up making the work about the film, and it's sort of centered, like it's like look at me, look what I'm doing, which is not what I'm saying you're doing, Hannah, but it's something I'm wrestling with too. Is are we just looking in a new way? Are we also showing how we're looking? And part of the paradox is like the legibility, because I think there's certain expectations among lots of viewers of nonfiction films that documentaries are a certain kind of thing. You know, it's about, oh, this is what happened, or this is the truth. And there's this kind of brackish water of, you know, the relativism of it's about different perspectives. And so I'm wrestling with this. I'm curious to your thoughts about how we translate or make visible these processes. Do we need to, and just kind of where do we walk in these ways, or where are you walking in these ways?
I think that's a great question. And I also just want to acknowledge, so Eddie is one of the people that I've been in conversation about these kinds of practices for many years. And there's actually quite a few people on this call who I have. So all of you have totally contributed to, you know, like I feel like I've been in development with you around these ideas. So Eddie, I mean, I hope you're not expecting an answer from me because I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that it does seem like projects are really different depending on this. And I guess, you know, some of what I've been doing in my PhD is I've been learning about the history of documentary, which I didn't know before. And one thing that I've been learning, and for anyone here who has done documentary studies, this is so obvious, but for me, it was kind of a revelation that this mode between reflexivity and realism, that has been the kind, like you can trace so much of documentary through the move between reflexivity, realism, reflexivity, realism, reflexivity, realism. And again, it seems like a constant place of contestation, where people do a kind of realist aesthetic like cinema verite or Nanook of the North, and that's considered to be a much closer relationship to the truth. And then a bunch of people say that's bullshit. You know, like you have to show the seams, you have to show the filmmaker. And I guess sometimes I think, oh, I guess, and I'm a bit hooked on this contestation idea, but I'm like, oh, documentary that's part of what it's contesting, is authorship and reality and the presentation of realism. And so we're not going to know the answer, but we're going to be constantly in that tension. And some of our job might be about what is the productive tension for the films that we're making right now. And I don't know what that means in terms of what to do, but I think that is potentially generative, you know. But I also will just add, Eddie, I think like often a lot of my kind of subjectivity in the film comes through the editing. And I personally think that's totally valid. But I think you're asking a bigger question, which is like how much of the kind of the constructedness of the film needs to be seen versus not. And I don't know, I'm a big fan of the constructedness being seen, but that might be a taste thing. I do actually think it's a political thing for me, but I don't know. And maybe I can just add one other thing, which is that for Badlands so far, you hear my voice behind the camera, and we might have a scene where we introduce ourselves as, and then we'll probably fade away. But it's a question I'm asking about the Badlands too. I really don't know. I actually can't tell how to do it.
Yeah, I'll just share, like with my current film, we had a lot of challenges in the rough cut with me being in the film or not in similar apparatus ways. And the feedback, it always kind of came back to like a traditional character, like, oh, are you a character or not? The apparatus was people were attaching it to like a story, character, emotional connection. Do we know about you? Do you have a backstory? So I found that really interesting, that to be part of it, I had to be a character in a lot of like our viewers' minds, and that kind of challenged my understanding of what, and I'm not in the film really now, because thank God. But yeah, anyway, I just thank you for sharing. Appreciate it.
Thanks for that question, Eddie.
Thank you, Eddie. So we're getting near half. What is the hour where where ODL is half one, half two, whatever the time is with you. We're getting near the end of the session. I see two questions, and I think that Bijal you had your hand up a while ago, so perhaps I'll take yours first, and we'll probably wind up after these two questions. So yeah. Bijal, can you unmute yourself and
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
hi?
I'm trying to put my video on as well, but thank you so much, Hannah, for this wonderful talk and your fabulous work. You mentioned generative a number of times. You mentioned like bespoke technical workflows that you're kind of doing. It all seems to kind of point to this AI movement we're kind of in right now in filmmaking. And it also seems that you're sort of borrowing from ethnographic studies to me, like visual ethnographies, sensory ethnographies, about groups of people. So I'm curious how you see AI and maybe ethnographic studies, moving forward, and if it will inform your work, in fact.
That seems like a very timely question, and I'm sort of horrified to say that I have no idea. In our collaboration, Alexander is very much the person who's thinking deeply about these kinds of new techniques. And I think that, so I think he'd be the person to ask about this. He's also teaching a course around AI right now at Johns Hopkins. So he's like very much in that world. I'm less in that world. And so I'm so sorry, but I don't think I'm equipped to speak to that right now. I'm sorry, that's a disappointing answer.
I mean, maybe just from your perspective, since you are close to it and you see it and you are using these tools, you might have some thought about what like in the next 6 months, we're gonna have a different set of filmmaking tools. Maybe you have or maybe you don't. But thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm
I
sorry.
think I'm gonna let Hannah pass on that one because she's thinking about a lot of things, and actually, I don't think you have to have a view on AI as well. So Ardu Cow, there you are. I can see you. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so I'll try to be quick since I know we're at time. So I'm new to this community and to documentary filmmaking. So please forgive me. I'm going to just give some quick background before I ask my question. So I'm an animator. I make fiction films. I teach at through the MIT Office of Minority Education. And I've been working on a narrative animation about Black and brown, feminine, and trans folks amidst research misconduct in the global South. And many of the performers are recovering STEM workers in the MIT extended community. And I was thinking about turning some of the vocal and facial motion capture recordings, like the outtakes, into a documentary. And I was wondering, so my question is particularly with your community frameworks, your ethical frameworks, if you have any tips or cautionary notes, particularly for, narrative filmmakers, animators, wishing to explore documentary.
How fun that you're opening up that whole world. First of all, I just acknowledge you for doing that. Like I don't know, it's hard to take on a whole new way of working. I think there are quite a lot of practices borrowed from activists or social practices that I think can be really helpful. I think things like community workshops where you can, a lot of, I'll just say from our point, so a lot of what we try to do is we try to have conversations with people about what they care about and try to understand that. And so Alexander and I will talk with the, the people that we're filming with, but also our team members on the project, and try to understand why they're joining this project. What are they where are they at in their life? Why do they care? Like what are they trying to create in the world? And then what we try to do, and again, it's imperfect, but what we try to do is we try to consider the things that they're trying to do as metrics of success for the project as well. And I think that can be really wonderful. You also really get to know people. You really get to understand what they're out to make. And then the project can end up becoming more of a way of trying to make those things exist in the world. And I think, again, some of this is about trying to counteract these other impulses. It's so easy in a film for it to become outcome based and for people to get all kinds of crazy about like, if the film's going to get into this festival or if the film's going to get this kind of metric of success. So one of the things about working in this other way is it can be a kind of antidote. Like, okay, well, my head's gone all wild about if I got rejected from this festival, but I centered the metrics of these other successes. And now I can look to them and say, are they happening? Is the collaboration going really well? Is this person getting what they wanted out of it? And again, it's another sort of tool for course correction that I've found. So I personally think starting with those maybe facilitated conversations can be a really wonderful way to do it. And then we just also try to do lots of check-ins with people. I mean, I'm like an over communicator, which has its problems and is good. But that's one of the tips that I mean, that's one of the things that I've tried to do. It's a little bit like, this model of consent where you don't get it once, you keep getting, like, consent is actually an ongoing thing. I think that's a really helpful model. And I think that can look in many different ways.
Okay, so Hannah, I'm just going to want to thank you for such a thoughtful, generous presentation, and one that I know is going to resonate with me, and I'm sure with others here, because I wrote down this quote, about allowing our curiosity to guide us and ethically bind us. I think whether we're documentary makers or researchers in this conversation, that is just such an important way of thinking about our work. So thank you so much, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This incredible talk and so thought-provoking and honest. It's been a real gift to hear your interrogation and critique of the documentary practice, of your practice, and how you're thinking about it. So thank you for sharing. And thank you, Mandy, for moderating, and to Akhnaarat Turiev for producing this whole session, and to all of you for joining us today, and to our funders, MacArthur Foundation and Ford Foundation. And please join us again on December 10th, when we will have May Abdallah, who's an immersive filmmaker and maker, and we will be back then. So thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you all.